No, and there's no screen now. It's going to be you in like 3 seconds. So. Wow, this is really loud. שלומי, אפשר קצת להנמיך? זה נשמע לי, נכון? זה נורא חזק. Okay. Are we already online also? Yeah? Okay. Okay, I'll just step away from the microphone a little bit while they're fixing the microphone. Yeah? Better now? Yeah, okay. So thank you all for coming here. We're very excited to be hosting this wonderful conference that is both diverse in its location and interdisciplinary in its approach, combining scholars from communication, history, and English, the humanities, and the social sciences. I'm delighted, first of all, to introduce my friend and colleague, Daphne Canetti, Professor of Political Science and Dean of the Social Sciences at the University of Haifa, to officially open our proceedings. Good afternoon, good evening. What's the protocol? So Ayelet, thank you for inviting me. I'm not going to be brief, and I'm not going to do it in a British accent, but I'm going to do my best. Shalom. The British Broadcasting Company, as the BBC was originally named, was formed on 18th of October 1922 by a group of leading wireless manufacturers. 21 years later, on June the 2nd, 1953, the BBC marked the beginning of history as it broadcast the coronation of Queen Elizabeth, crowning the BBC as mainstream media and the essence of communication liberty. Outside the BBC headquarters in London stands a statue of George Orwell. The wall behind the statue is inscribed with Orwell's words about the substance of liberty. If liberty means anything at all, it means that it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. I believe it is our duty as scientists to stand by these words and act upon them for the sake of humanity. Staying with Orwell, it is believed that the notorious Room 101 in his 1984 dystopian social science fiction novel is based on the room he worked in while at the BBC. Speaking as a political scientist, the work done in my lab demonstrates that Orwell's science fiction has become today's science fact. The liberal and borderless cybersphere has brought many opportunities to engage and make connections, condensing time and space. Alongside these, emerging terror threats, such as cyber terror on critical infrastructure, have the power to shake democratic pillars and undermine trust in leadership. As Orwell predicted, or perhaps forewarned, today's governments are surveilling our metadata to uncover adversaries in cybersphere. It is only fitting that the Queen's funeral procession tomorrow be broadcast on the BBC Centennial. Is this the right British word? As the coronation marked a new chapter in BBC's story, so will the broadcast of the Queen's funeral procession mark the end of an era of steadfast leadership. This will be the day that one chapter in the book of history ends and another chapter emerges. This conference
is all about history as it is broadcast through the BBC's lens. As mainstream media that has been at the forefront of British history throughout the ages, the BBC has projected images of war and conflict alongside moments of British pride. It has been a liberal instrument in the formation of trust in times of civil upheaval and unrest. As you see, history is made up of social aspects intertwined with humanities. This merge has also allowed for the creation and organization, I guess, of this conference as scholars from the Department of English language and literature, English literature. No more language. The Department of History, General History. I know there's a good number of histories in general and here. And the Department of Communication have become together to celebrate the BBC centenary. As Dean of Social Science Faculty, I'm proud at this scholarly collaboration. By combining our own unique areas of expertise, we can predict trends by strengthening resilience, public trust in leadership, and prevent the erosion of democratic pillars. I will conclude with the Queen's wise words. It is through this lens of history that we should view the conflicts of today, and so give us hope for tomorrow. Thank you. Enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Professor Canetti. I will begin my opening remarks on a personal note. While not something I often get to talk about in academic contexts, broadcast news was central to the first half of my life. My father is actually a journalist, one of the team of young men and some women who in 1968, the year I was born, founded Israel Television, the television arm of the Israel Broadcasting Authority, modeled after, you guessed it, the BBC. Our house revolved around news and media events, and we circumnavigated the world, or at least parts of it, trailing him to his various postings. I owe my English to the various international schools I attended, most prominently the British Embassy Preparatory School, BEPS, in Bonn, then West Germany, where I attended school with a couple of hundred other children from all over the world, daughters and sons of Commonwealth diplomats and journalists. I have no doubt that my parents' decision to send us to BEPS rather than to the louder, bigger, noisier American embassy school down the road, where most of the other Israeli children went, had to do with the reverence in which the BBC was always treated in our house, where it was code for integrity, for thoroughness, for what broadcast journalism could and should aspire to be. As I grew up, this ideal became more complicated. In my days as a young student, my experience and English helped me secure a series of lucrative student jobs at various foreign news outlets, WTN, APTV, CBS News. As I worked the night and weekend desk, the politics of this place where I lived revealed themselves as increasingly complicated and problematic, as did the role of the journalism that mediated it to the world. The double vision afforded by my Israeliness on the one hand and the foreign gaze that I was at once seeing and helping create raised more questions than it answered. In 1998, I finished my MA and worked my last shift at CBS, leaving journalism, but not English, in favor of grad school and literature at Berkeley. I took with me, indeed cultivated, the double gaze of critical ambivalence towards the role of English in our world, the events, ideas, and meanings that it mediates and creates. Indeed, Although it broadcasts in over 40 languages, the BBC is a symbol of the Anglophone world, of an Anglophone world, perhaps the symbol of the Anglophone world. But it is also a symbol of an Anglophile world, which, as we all know, smacks of complicity with imperialism, old and neo, with Eurocentrism, with Orientalism. Addressing this linguistic, political, and cultural complexity became one of my central preoccupations as a scholar. Literary critic Amir Mufti entreats us to forget English, that's the title of his 2012 book, arguing that our contemporary embrace of world literature, especially, but not only in English, occludes the Orientalism and colonial history intimately folded into these texts. Rather than enabling knowledge of disparate writing practices and traditions of the world, he argues, English is naturalized as a neutral and transparent medium, both as the language of literary expression and as the undisputed language of global capitalism. My own approach is different, and I assume that it is shared by many of us in this room, training our double vision on the BBC and its relation to the world. Rather than an Anglophone literature that, quote, naturalizes itself, erasing the scene of politics and power that marks its emergence, as Mufti would have it, I argue that critical attention to their English, reinvests Anglophone texts with their historical, political, and formal density. Rather than reading English transparently and unproblematically as the world, we read what English does and has done in the world and to the world. Rather than forgetting English, we enter its fray. Instead of distancing ourselves from its compromised history, we address our location and complicity within it. Mutatis mutandis, I imagine this argument will come up in the next 3 days as well. This conference is also of special significance, as it is, if not formally, then in effect, the first public-facing event of a center that is yet to come. For many years, joined by Tal and others in this room, I have harbored an ambition which is slowly inching its way into being, to found an interdisciplinary center for post-colonial studies, or beyond post-colonial studies, to be located at Haifa. The rationale for this center is the perceived impasse in the once robust and innovative field of post-colonial studies, increasingly unable to conceptualize the persistence of uneven relations of power, at times inadequate to the task of accounting for contemporary political formations and new theoretical challenges. We hope that the center, when it is formally founded, and in this sort of prequel of a conference, will account for the varied historical situations and cultural manifestations of colonial and post-colonial experiences. Considering, for example, the British Empire and its decline from the perspective of and within its margins, we hope to reveal a dense nexus of colonial and post-colonial experiences, questioning the very premise of marginality. All of this is to say that I'm nervous and excited to open this conference in and of itself, but also to open a wide and hopefully long-term conversation. Now to the thank yous. There are many people and institutions to thank for making this possible. The Humanities and Social Science Fund of the Israel Academy of Science, whose logo is our masthead, gave us a generous grant to make this conference a reality. The University of Haifa's Vice President for Internationalization in the city of Haifa also generously supplied additional funding. Our organizing committee, Paul Frosch from the Communication Department at Hebrew University, Eitan Bar-Yosef from the Department of Foreign Language, Literatures and Linguistics from Ben Gurion University, Oren Myers from Communication here in Haifa, Tzur Shalev from History in Haifa, have made this a truly interdisciplinary and multi-institutional event and made important interventions when we needed them. Osvaldo Dieguez came up with the original design idea, and the talented Marina Bugayev picked it up to design our poster, programs, cups, etc., always willing to make one more correction or to indulge another whim. Tammy Lafiel is the expert on planning and running a conference. Who knows where we would have been without her? Shlomi Abukhsis is running technology with help. Thank you so much for everything, Shlomi, before, during, and after the conference. Aaron Refter from the Humanities is as always an enabler. Hila Heinemann has the best advice. And our students, Mariana Akawi, Lihi Laszlo, and Shuruk Mahmed. Could you guys say, you all know them. They are here to help make all of this run smoothly, so feel free to come to them or to us. But this conference is really the brainchild of Tal Zelmanovich, who came to me some 2 years ago with the idea for this conference. Her infectious enthusiasm and the brilliance and timeliness of her idea left me no choice but to follow in her wake. In early 2020, we couldn't imagine all the hurdles we would have to overcome. I think the words, "It will be over by summer," were uttered. But Tal's tenacity and optimism, as well as the clarity of her vision, carried us through those days to this day. The terrific program she carefully curated is testament to this vision, to her expertise, her organizational breadth, and intellectual depth. I'm sure that I speak for all of us in thanking you, Tal, for making this happen, for making it happen so well, and for bringing us here together. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you, Ayelet, for all these amazing words, and thanks all of you for coming. That's quite a long way to come all the way to Haifa, and we're really, really excited to have you here, and we're really looking forward to these next 3 days. And when we thought about this conference, David Hendy's book, The BBC, A People's History, just came out, and we thought he would be one of the best people to talk about researching the BBC and kind of having this whole picture of the centenary. David has been working a lot in the last year and also has been on leave, but he very graciously agreed to record an interview with me and talk about his work and talk about researching the BBC. So it's a bit unusual, but we will broadcast or show you now this interview. We recorded it at the beginning of July, and I hope it would be a nice way to kind of kick off our debates or discussions. An honor to open our conference with a conversation with Professor Emeritus David Hendy. David is a leading expert on the history of the BBC. Indeed, his recent monograph, The BBC, A People's History, published by Profile Books in January 2022, is a detailed, passionate, compassionate, and at times critical account of the institution and its people and audiences. He's a media historian and former BBC producer, and it is both with the scholars and the practitioners' intimate knowledge of the topic that he approaches his scholarship. The BBC, A People's History is his 5th monograph. Previous books include Radio in the Global Age, Life on Air, A History of Radio 4, which won the Longman's History Today Book of the Year Award, Public Service Broadcasting, and Noise, A Human History of Sound and Listening. He's contributed to academic journals and edited collection, but has also published short essays and reviews in, among others, Cambridge Literary Review, History Today, Wall Street Journal, Irish Independent, Scotsman, and The Observer. Since taking early retirement from the University of Sussex in December 2021, he's focused on writing and broadcasting. And throughout 2022, he's been writing a monthly column for the BBC History magazine, BBC at 100, featuring key episode in the corporation's history and appearing on the History Extra podcast. David also regularly contributes to BBC Radio 3 and BBC Radio 4. In 2011, he co-wrote Between Two Worlds, a Sunday drama about the life of the Edwardian physicist and spiritualist Oliver Lodge. David studied history at St. Andrews and Oxford universities before joining the BBC in 1987 as a trainee journalist and producer. And at the BBC, he later worked on The World Tonight and Analysis on Radio 4. In 2011, he was awarded the James Carey Award for Outstanding Journalist by the Media Ecology Association of North America for his 5-part BBC Radio 3 series, Rewiring the Mind. He's also held 2 Leverhulme Research Fellowships, and between 2017 and 2021, he was the principal investigator on the 4-year AHRC-funded Connected History of the BBC project. David, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me to the conference.
The BBC has been central to your life, as I said in the introduction, both as a journalist, as an academic, but I was wondering, what was your first memory of the BBC?
Wow, that's you've started with the hardest question. I mean, I suppose, like many of my contemporaries, I watched children's television and children's programs in the kind of early afternoon, after school. I don't have many memories before that, but I can remember watching things like Blue Peter, which I suppose in many ways is a classic BBC program, a kind of, live mixed magazine with kind of travel reports and studio discussions and kind of making things and so on. So I guess, children's programs, first of all. I was vaguely aware, I think, of news reports about the war in Vietnam, for instance. I was, as a young boy, absorbed by watching the Apollo space program. And then I think, as I became a teenager, listening to radio, and this is a kind of common pattern, one retreats into one's bedroom as a teenager, and listening late night to Radio 1, the pop radio station. Late at night, the music tended to be a little bit more adventurous and a bit more interesting. So DJs like John Peel became an important part of my life. And then I suppose when I was a student and undergraduate, you don't have access to a television, or you didn't in those days, very easily. And again, I started listening to The Archers, the long-running radio or soap opera, and became perhaps middle-aged before my time. So those, I guess, are my earliest memories. A bit of television, a bit of radio.
So, but as you describe, I mean, the BBC was intertwined in your kind of daily routines and daily lives. And I think, in a sense, that's kind of what you claim in the book, how integrated the BBC is into the life of the nation. I think you even say that it occupied a quasi-mystical place in the national psyche.
Yeah.
And,
and I think that's, I think, I mean, I quote Asa Briggs. I mean, I don't think I'm the first person to have this thought. And, Asa Briggs made the wonderful remark, in a sense, to write the history of broadcasting is to write the history of everything else. And I think that's true.
So maybe you can say a bit more about, how you interpret this relationship, and maybe even how your recent projects may have changed your understanding of the place that the BBC occupies in the life of the nation.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, this ties in with the title of the book, or rather the subtitle, which is A People's History. And it's a people's history partly because of that kind of intimate interrelationship between broadcasting and society. I mean, for me as a kind of cultural historian, you know, broadcasting and social history are kind of inseparable. So that's kind of one thing which has sort of informed my approach. I mean, the other thing to say, of course, is that, you know, I'm not clearly not the first person to be writing a history of the BBC, apart from anything else. As mentioned, Asa Briggs, you know, he's written that monumental 5-volume history, 4,000 pages or thereabouts in total. We've also had a 6th volume from Gene Seaton, another 400 pages or so, you know, added on, which takes us up to 1987. And of course, you know, and then there's a whole array of other scholarship. I mean, there's you know, the work, Simon Potter's work and Alban Webb's work on the World Service and international broadcasting, and countless special studies. So of course one absorbs that, reads it, and then for me the task was to almost forget it because I think the danger, if you're commissioned to write a single volume history of the BBC, the danger is you're compressing everything. You're trying to cover everything. And I think that would result in something kind of breathless and superficial. So as, you know, writers about the BBC know, you have to be selective. It's going to be highly selective. I mean, this is an organisation that has broadcast somewhere between 10 and 20 million programs, and the written archive is vast and so on. So I suppose that's where my experience as a program maker starts to kick in, I suppose. I worked for the BBC, as you mentioned, for about 7 years as a producer. And I suppose that means that I wanted to bring the kind of program maker's perspective to the kind of historical scholarship, which I hope is also there. And I think what that means is that, for me, you know, the BBC is not, I mean, it is an institution, it's got this kind of quasi-mystical status and so on and so forth, but it's not a monolith. And it also, I think, needs to be understood not just as an institution, but as a kind of creative community. Complicated creative community, or perhaps more accurately, lots of different creative communities. Because as soon as you start thinking about the program makers and listening to their experience, you see that it isn't a monolith. I mean, there are lots of competing ideas. There's a whole world of argument and debate behind every program. So I think that was the starting point. Something else that was in the back of my head, I suppose, I wasn't conscious of this quotation at the time that I was writing, and I read it since, but it captures what I think I was trying to do. Bear with me, I'm going to read it out. And it's a quotation from John Eliot, the historian of imperial Spain. Not a broadcasting historian at all, but it seems apposite to me. He said, "The task of the historian is to enter imaginatively into the life of a society remote in time and place, and produce a plausible explanation of why its inhabitants thought and behaved as they did." So I think that actually captures what I was trying to do, which is to sit alongside the people, the inhabitants of the BBC, and try and work out how and why they thought and behaved as they did. And that, of course, is where the project I've been involved with, exploring the oral history of the BBC, has been particularly helpful and relevant, because it means that, I mean, the BBC Oral History Archive, I should add, is about 600 interviews with former members of staff, director generals, down to lift attendants and people working in the duplicating department, and all sorts in between, engineers, program makers, people like David Attenborough and so on, who've had a long career with the BBC. And we know the various difficulties and problems with oral history, but when you've got that size corpus of kind of first-hand accounts of people who were there at the beginning of the BBC in the 1920s, or beginning of television in the 1930s, or during the Second World War, the Suez Crisis and the Falklands War, and so on, you can start to kind of build a kind of fairly, I mean, I hope, a kind of kaleidoscopic picture of the BBC as a kind of thinking organisation. A kind of, there's an ecology, I think, to the BBC. where, you know, it's not about top-down commands and programs being made to order. There's something more nuanced and complex going on there, and you're dealing with human beings who have ideals and passions and fallibilities as well, and that is what makes, for me, the story interesting, to kind of have that human dimension through the kind of the narrative of the BBC, the kind of the overall arc that we know about, to kind of infuse it with those sort of personal tales. And I think that the last thing to say about this, I think, is that, you know, historians are generally a little bit dubious about anecdotes. but for me, and maybe again this is where my program maker's perspective comes in, you know, as a program maker, you're told show, don't tell, right? Don't just say something happened, show that it happened. And so you do it through stories, particular incidents, moments, vignettes, if you like. And I think as long as you are sure that those vignettes, those stories are well chosen, they can be the means of embodying a kind of more abstract idea. And you know, we know that history writing isn't a kind of pure kind of construction of factual narrative. It is about storytelling to some extent. And when you're doing that, you want to be able to kind of embody an idea rather than just be abstract about it. So I suppose there's a sort of, you know, my experience of running the oral history project, which is about taking hold of these hundreds of interviews, digitizing them, and we're just in the final stages of putting these into the public realm. That and my program making experience, I think, have shaped the way in which I approached the history of the BBC.
Okay, so I've got like 5 follow-up questions about that, so I'll have to reorder them in a way. So first of all, I'd love to hear more about the creation of this oral histories archive, you know, because you kind of describe it as, you know, taking interviews from people that, you know, worked in the BBC from its very beginning. And as we know, this is a centennial moment. So I'm curious about, you know, how these interviews were procured and, you know, how you got hold of them, and extremely curious about what will be their fate. Especially because, you know, as somebody who worked at the BBC written archives, I know how opaque this archive really is, how hard it is to kind of navigate as a researcher, how dependent you are on an archivist. So, and I think your project is more about opening these archives, as at least what I saw from, you know, the website that accompanies the project. So one question is about the creation of this archive. The second is about how transparent this BBC archive should be. Let's start with these.
Okay, well, I mean, so the BBC Oral History Archive sort of started in 1972 when the BBC was 50 years old. So the BBC, at its 50th birthday, had a party in Broadcasting House, and Frank Gillard, who'd been a war correspondent and was, you know, been a sort of senior executive of BBC Radio in the 1960s, was at that party, and he looked around and saw that at that party were many of the founding figures of the BBC, and he thought, they're going to die soon, and their memories, their accounts of the early BBC need to be captured for posterity. And so he had permission to start a process of recording what were really defined as exit interviews. In other words, it was with members of staff just after they'd retired or left the BBC. And the idea and the thinking was that they could speak frankly and in detail about what they witnessed and their experiences and their colleagues and so on, and that these recordings would not be instantly available to the public. This was a kind of corporate archive. It wasn't actually a kind of, you know, something designed for the public or even academic researchers. It was something for the BBC's own archives, with the understanding that maybe when it came to the centenary, maybe the BBC's own program makers might find these as a useful resource for telling the history of the BBC. And the first interviews were recorded on audio tape, and then eventually they started to be filmed, first of all on 16mm, and then on video, and then the audio changed to digital and so on. And so these were it ended up being quite a chaotic jumble of different formats, different lengths, conducted over many, many years. That the project is still running. There are still people being interviewed for this. So it's a growing archive, a steadily growing archive. And I mean, our involvement at the University of Sussex was to work with the BBC to try and find the best way for bringing these interviews, or as many of them as possible, into the public realm. And beyond just simply saying, right, here's a recording, let's digitize it and let's put it on a website, what we wanted to do was to make it not just viewable, but searchable and analyzable as a corpus of interviews. So in other words, for instance, take a great BBC figure like Grace Wyndham Goldie, an important figure in 1950s, 1960s BBC television. There are several interviews with her, but also she is mentioned by many, many people who worked with her. And there would be no way of knowing that or accessing that unless all these interviews were in some sense searchable, cross-searchable, and so on. So part of the task has been to not just digitize and collect and put online, but to think of ways of making the transcripts searchable. There were original transcripts supplied, but they're a little bit messy. So, going through and doing things like a new set of voice to text transcriptions and correcting those and so on. So it's a long and complicated process. And into the mix is the BBC's anxiety about these interviews, because no one really has known up till now exactly what's in them. I mean, people have looked at them one by one, individually, selectively, but there are a lot of them. And actually to know exactly what they say presents anxiety to the BBC, because it's an institution which is under attack. It's an institution in which it knows perhaps of bad faith who will look into an archive like this, quote selectively, and represent the BBC in a kind of, in perhaps a bad light. So in many ways, it's kind of extraordinary of the BBC to kind of collaborate in making this material open when it doesn't quite fully know exactly what's in it. Now, there are some restrictions. It's not the complete archive that's going to be made publicly available this year. There are some interviews with living people who refer to other living people for reasons of confidentiality or sensitivity. Those are not yet available to the public, but the majority of them will be. So we're talking about 3/4 or thereabouts of the interviews that have been done, including some of the more recent ones, will be available, and they'll be available on a website which will reside at the University of Sussex.
I want to ask you about something that Stuart Hall very famously said, of course, in the late 70s, that any discussion of race and immigration in Britain across all media forms and genres follows the same formula that he called racist logic, that immigrants equals black, equal too many of them equals send them back. Hall kind of described this racist logic as pervading all UK media and of course also the BBC. How much did you feel that this racist logic was part of the BBC, and is it still part of the coverage of Black Britain's race, immigration today?
I mean, I suppose, this is a huge and complex subject. I would say Stuart Hall is sort of half right. In other words, you look at the BBC. There's a reason I quote Clive James in the book, And there's a reason to quote Clive James. There's a quote from him where he says basically, the more you watch, the more television you watch, he was talking about television, the more television you watch, the harder it is to generalize. And he was kind of, I think that's an important point. Because if you look, for instance, at the BBC's history of dealing with increasing cultural diversity in Britain, especially after the war, you have a very ambivalent kind of picture emerges. You've got, first of all, a BBC that is ahead of other institutions in terms of kind of hiring people from the Caribbean, for instance, from the Indian subcontinent, and so on. And then the BBC, by the end of the Second World War, is a quite cosmopolitan institution. I mean, the Wartime Monitoring Service had nearly 1,000 people working for it, the vast majority of whom were refugees from Europe. It also had very close relations with African countries, the dominions and the colonies, as they were called at the time. So there was a kind of international understanding that was there within the BBC, but certainly within news and current affairs. If you look at the output in the late 40s, the 1950s, even the early 60s, it tends to deal with issues about immigration as a problem. And very often as a problem for the kind of the host community. So it's kind of, in one sense, it's sort of well-meaning. How can we, this is where the BBC's kind of desire for consensus, if you like, kind of works against it, because it tends to kind of paper over the cracks of difference, really. It rather kind of hopes, and this goes right back to its beginnings in the 1920s, coming out of the First World War. It's really kind of about, how do we make the world a better place? We make the world a better place by increasing kind of mutual understanding and harmony and so on. And so that makes it uncomfortable dealing with issues of identity and difference. And there's a strong strand in the programs that it makes in the 1950s and the early 1960s, which are essentially assimilationist. In other words, it kind of starts with this kind of well-meaning desire. How do we help immigrant communities in Britain to integrate with British society? And it becomes assimilationist because the assumption is, well, they've got to learn how to be like us. There's much less than you would want to see of us learning from them, as it were. Now, there are, as always with the BBC, exceptions, So, one of the series that I write about in some detail in the book is a series that went out on the third programme in 1964, which was a collaboration between the BBC producer Geoffrey Bridson and the Harlem poet Langston Hughes, who was brought in as kind of co-producer. And that was an extraordinary series of 19 programmes that very much embraced the perspective, the African-American perspective at a critical moment in civil rights. I find it quite interesting that the BBC found it easier to focus on the African-American civil rights movement than kind of issues of race in its own, backyard, as it were. So again, is it good? Is it bad? It's kind of both at the same time. Now, fast forward to the present day, I think the BBC has caught up and it's done a lot of work to catch up. It knows that it's kind of duty bound in some way as a organisation funded by the majority of people to somehow reflect the majority of people, to reflect Britain in all its diversity and complexity. And I think that it's been stung by the perfectly valid criticism of its past performance. And it's done a lot of catching up, I think, work behind the scenes. But it's, again, it's an institution that kind of carries a sort of time lag. It's a kind of, it's still a predominantly white, predominantly middle-class institution with people in senior positions who don't necessarily fully understand the sensitivities of of identity politics. Let's just take a really positive development. one of the things that the BBC did recently, it broadcast a series of films by the Oscar-winning director Steve McQueen under the umbrella title Small Axe. Amazing film.
Unbelievable.
Wonderful
films. Television.
And not only were they kind of good films, but they were the kind of films that you would normally expect to see on BBC Two, of minority interest, if you like. But no, they were put on BBC One on a Sunday evening. That is the prime BBC drama time. They had disappointing viewing figures, as I think the BBC knew they would, because some of them were quite challenging. And I kind of think, well done, the BBC, for putting them on BBC One, prime time. And in a sense, that was the BBC saying a kind of atonement for its past in many ways, and saying these films are important, and it's important that they're on the BBC, and it's important for the BBC to support them. And it was very interesting that, for instance, Steve McQueen himself, when interviewed about why they were on the BBC as opposed to, say, Netflix, the point he made was, but my mum watches the BBC. I wanted my mum to see them. So there was still this sort of sense in which the BBC was a space in which work like this, which fleshed out moments of British history that we should know more about. Terrible episodes of racism in the police and so on. They were kind of, amazing dramas, but, they were given a kind of peak time performance. Now, and we can think about this if we think about the international dimensions of the BBC, the international broadcasting of the BBC. Here's another quote, which I want to get the words right. This is from Agnès Poirier, who's a French journalist, usually based in London. And she's talking about the World Service. And she talks about her grandparents having listened to the BBC during the Nazi occupation of France. And she saw the BBC as the only one that told, her grandparents, saw the BBC as the only one that told the truth and gave the facts. And then she says, collective memory is a strong muscle. Today, the BBC is Britain's soft power incarnate. There is no greater tool to its influence in the world. Well, I mean, as historians, that's really interesting, right? The idea of kind of this powerful kind of muscle memory, if you like, that was built up, the BBC establishing this international reputation during the war, when its relationship with the government was complex. I mean, it was kind of it was under the guidance of the government.
Funded by the foreign
funded
office.
Funded by the government. But people who are working with the government, working for the BBC during the war, dealing with the political warfare executive and government ministries and so on, Alan Bullock described the relationship as pull and push. In other words, there was a dialogue there. There was pushback from the BBC. And by the end of the war, I would say, on balance, the BBC had established a sort of reputation that was fairly powerful for being truthful, being reliable, being accurate. It wasn't always telling the full truth. It couldn't tell the full truth. But that reputation kind of established a kind of global brand, if you like. But at the same time, there's another dimension to this international broadcasting, that tradition of broadcasting to the Empire Service, which started in 1932, and then after the war it's the Commonwealth rather than the Empire. And yet this is kind of about the projection of Britain, right? That's the task of the BBC, funded at that stage by the Foreign Office, the projection of Britain. Well, what kind of Britain is projected? All I would say is that, again, the internal, behind-the-scenes history of the World Service and its kind of various predecessors, the external services, the overseas service, and so on, opens up the complexity of this. Yes, it is projecting a kind of version of Britain which is always, in some sense, flattering, but it's not necessarily always the version of Britain which is fully government-approved. So yes, there's it's impossible in a sense, I think, to kind of reduce it to, it is clearly not a mouthpiece for government. It clearly in some way, because of the range of programming it offers a range of portraits of Britain, if you like.
And one last question maybe about the future, and that is, are there any questions or avenues that you think still remain unanswered or maybe under-researched about the BBC?
Yeah, I mean, very often the kind of answer to that is you say, well, it's under-researched because you haven't looked at it yourself and other people have. So to some extent, your question is a hostage to fortune. Someone will pop up and say, aha, that's been done. I mean, I would say in broad terms. For you. Okay. Well, I suppose in broad terms, I think there's more interesting work that's needed on the kind of end of empire, I think, and how the BBC story fits in with that. And obviously we've had some extraordinarily good studies from authors like Simon Potter and Alban Webb who've looked at the kind of the post-war external broadcasting of the BBC and how that fits in with imperial history. And I think there's kind of, in many ways, the next task is to kind of look in granular detail at how notions of end of empire and changing senses of identity and so on were reflected and embodied at the sort of level of programs and output and so on. So I think that's one area that I think would be really, really fruitful to explore. I think the other thing I would say is that I tried in one of the later sections of the book to offer what to my mind was a kind of first draft, if you like, of the story of the BBC and the digital revolution. The BBC's, I think, important role in establishing establishing itself as a kind of online entity, and the origins of iPlayer and so on, and how that related to the kind of the popularity of streaming services, video on demand, a popularity that companies like Netflix have since built on. And I think that, to me, it felt like it was a first draft. It was setting out the kind of the basic narrative line of what happened in the 1990s. But there's clearly a lot more work, I think, that could be done, because that feels to me an important part of the BBC's history that perhaps we still haven't quite yet had enough distance from to be able to look at kind of objectively. And because a lot of the people are still alive and so on, we can perhaps capture those first-hand accounts before it's too late. So I think that's one thing I would say. Maybe if there's a third element, I would say the challenge that I think we have as historians is that we tend to be attracted to kind of the high culture stuff, the serious stuff, just by our kind of very nature. We're interested in things like talks and documentaries and dramas and features and policy and the relationship with national politics and international global politics and so on. And perhaps there's still work to be done on what we might call the majority of broadcasting, which is more ephemeral and pleasure related and lightweight and so on. And actually this is where this is where our colleagues in media studies have been ahead of us, which is that they've taken seriously popular culture and entertainment and soap operas and so on. And I think how wonderful it would be if historians can kind of bring a kind of rigorous historical analysis to things like that. And I think there are projects on the way. I mean, one of the kind of immensely popular lightweight drama serials that the BBC have run in recent years is called The Midwife, Sunday evening drama about kind of midwives in East London from the 1940s through to the 1960s. And it is kind of, in many ways, very standard drama, but it's also a wonderful insight into kind of changing health policies and poverty and social relations and so on. So I think, attending perhaps a little bit more to that kind of what we might think of as kind of ephemeral. And just one last point, if I've got time, is I think that, as historians, it's our job to be critical of the material. And I'm very pleased that at the beginning of this, you kind of said, well, the book is kind of sympathetic and compassionate, but also critical. I think of myself as a critical friend of the BBC. But what I would say is I kind of think as historians, one of the next tasks is to be willing, as well as being critical, if there's a fight to save the BBC, I think we should be willing to get to the barricades and take sides, actually. Because I think that, the BBC is in danger, especially under the current Conservative government. here. I think there is going to have to be a battle to save the BBC. And here I would say, there's some interesting words from another historian, Timothy Snyder, who's written this book on tyranny. And he says this in a section on institutions. He says, "It is institutions that help us to preserve decency. They need our help as well. Do not speak of our institutions unless you make them yours by acting on their behalf. Institutions do not protect themselves. They fall one after the other unless each is defended from the beginning. So choose an institution you care about, a court, a newspaper, a law, a labor union, and take its side." And I think that we have to probably think that whatever all of the faults of the BBC, if it disappears, what will replace it is probably going to be worse rather than better. I mean, I think that's a kind of cruel reality of contemporary society and politics. And on that basis, I think as historians, we have to be critical and we have to be objective, but we also have to be willing to run to the barricades and fight for something like the BBC.
Thank you. Nowhere better than to end with a call for protest, for fight, and for solidarity. I'm all for that. And thank you very, very much, David, for this really fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
was a great great interview.
Yeah.
And
Excuse me. Yes.
Weird format for a conference. I hope it kind of,
oh, it worked. It worked well.
Yeah.
It worked well.
We both enjoyed that
Yeah.
conversation very much. Yeah, definitely. You can tell.
And his closing comments about defending institutions and so on. I mean, on the one hand, as I get older, I'm a lot more interested in conservation in all senses than I used to be. But also in terms of the experiences that we're going through in the United States now, right, with the right-wing notion of tearing down institutions. It's exactly what he's talking about. What comes after is often a lot worse. You know?
no, whereas these are stereotypes. I remember watching the Japanese on TV.
Yeah.
We were just, we couldn't
Yeah.
either. I think I called you. You said turn on the
Told me,
TV.
yeah, right.
I shut in.
My husband was had a Zoom call with the other day. You have these conferences because I think there's a coup. I'm not sure. In the United States, it seems like anything could happen.
Yeah. Yeah. But the other thing,
We're still recovering, sorry.
the other thing that's frightening about it, and lots of friends and colleagues I know say it as much. You know, there would be a time before this. First of all, you think it's unbelievable. This could never happen in the United States. And I'm sure that there are lots of Americans who are still in shock and disbelief. This can't really be happening here. So at some level, you kind of tune it out. This is not possible. But it strikes you that, say, if you go back to Europe and World War II and all that happened there, the experience in the U.S. gave me a much, I think, better understanding of how something like that can happen. How people can turn vicious and act on, you know, age-old, sometimes millennial-old stereotypes and
But how fragile democracy really is. That's what, how that's what I grappled with, how fragile it is.
and part of that fragility is the way in which a population accommodates itself to incremental fascism. Because we look back from our comfortable position on that history, World War II in Europe, and think, how could good people have allowed this to happen? You realize that now there are lots of good people in the US, but you think like, this isn't really, so it's disbelief. And then it's like, there's nothing I can do to change it.
Definitely that.
And it happens until eventually when the really inhumane stuff starts happening, it's too late to stop it.
Evolve.
Right.
Because it was so short.
It was Mike Pence who called in the National Guard. It was not.
Yeah, it wasn't true. No, it was amazing. As I said, this is kind
We
of
were shocked and horrified. And
unbelievable.
can you imagine?
Right.
Power. Yeah.
Right,
You know,
right.
oh.
Right. But that's what I mean. Part of it. That's what I mean by the incrementalism of it and the complicity.
The complicity. Yeah.
Because another stock response is you take one individual, you hold that individual up as, you know, evil incarnate. This is the individual who caused it. No one individual could produce those kind of historical events.
They have to have support.
It's all those complicit Republicans and pro-right-wingers around Trump who facilitated that from the time he was elected.
But also, I think that the U.S. acclimated each time that Trump did something outrageous, we would wring our hands and this is crazy, and then we would adjust to that. And then, you know, a couple of weeks later, there'd be something else. And so it was incremental to, you know, that final storming of the Capitol. And that's when I think we realized, I think as a nation,
repeatedly in the news media, whenever anybody sort of critiques it and says, they did this, or this figure said this, the comeback always is, well, the Democrats did this. And when you look at the equivalent, it isn't by any stretch of the imagination equivalent.
I can't even talk about that. It's heartbreaking. Heartbreaking. So I think the midterm elections, which happen in November, are going to really take the pulse of the U.S. We're seeing signs that, people are going to vote on the side of sanity, but until that vote actually happens, right? In my lifetime, and our first female vice president. It happened.
But another part that I think is like the canaries in the coal mine. I think I've seen interviews, sort of small documentaries in different quarters in the U.S. of the Jews who lived through the Holocaust, the survivors who were living in the U.S. after that for decades. Much older generation dying out now, right? And talking about how what has happened and continues to happen in the U.S. frightens them, and it's deja vu, because they saw that before in Europe. That is what is frightening, because in one sense, they're the canaries in the coal mine. If it's giving them flashbacks, that should be telling us something. Nationalism, in fact, you see where you live, where I live, you see regularly trucks. It's almost always trucks, but sometimes cars as well, driving around with huge U.S. flags attached. I remember one time going down the highway, not far from where I live in Albany, and this was well after Trump lost the election. And there was a convoy of vehicles going somewhere upstate New York on the other side of the highway. There were, as I was driving, I was counting, and I got up to like 50 something, and then I lost count. So more than 50 something vehicles, all behind each other with all flying the U.S. flag, heading somewhere.
We'll see what November brings.
Yeah. But I mean, thank you for organizing this. And Ayala mentioned a center that's going to come.
Isn't it everyone?
In terms of dealing with administration at Haifa University, has anybody been talking about the possibility of like matching funds from the university if you get these funds?
I think it's already underground.
Right. Yeah.
Part of our
story in the English-speaking Caribbean. At the University of the West Indies, the professors who were the first wave of professors were English expats. And then that second wave were Caribbean-born faculty who went to England and studied. And then that third wave, the generation after them, tended to go, and still tend to go to US universities. In fact, that was the incentive. After I finished my first teaching job was at the University of West Indies Barbados campus. I started in 1989 there, and between 89 and 90 was when we changed from the British system of the year-long to the academic year to the US semester system, and the rationale was more of our graduates, more of our bachelors were graduates were going to seeking places in US universities to do graduate work, and operating on a semester system was more compatible and made it easier for the US officials to understand transcripts and all that. So. Thing that's happening to public universities in the US, and I hope that isn't happening here, is that so many of them are public in name only. I mean, SUNY is the largest,
particularly in New York.
Yeah, SUNY is the largest public university in the United States, and then the next big one is the University of California system. SUNY Albany, where I work, our funding from the government, this is a state university, is only 17%. 17. So we are a public university in name only. If the rest of that funding, 83%, whatever it is, comes from the private sector, you are really a private university, because the private folk who give the dollars will pretty much guide you in terms of what you can do with those dollars. You know? So public education that's another thing that is under threat in the United States.
I actually sent him a note. I said, international universities seem to have far fewer financial constraints than the ones in the U.S. right now. So, we maintain the Center for Humanity, Center for Post-Colonial Studies. Someone over there was talking about a Center for Humanities, and getting there.
The chasm, and there's that.
What do product teams do with a bright idea?
There's that gap in the U.S. education system already, the class gap, but I think it's going to be widened as public universities become less well-funded, and they're gutting the humanities, arts and humanities, and even the qualitative social sciences. So all the emphasis is on the quantitative and the empirical. So everything is STEM. And what I think is going to end up happening is it's going to increase the class divide. Working class and lower middle class children who can't afford to go to the private universities, the only option if they go to will be the public. And so they'll be forced in, everything will be like a polytechnic, training them for like middle management jobs. The families who are well off will be able to send their children to the Columbias and the Harvards and so on. And they will get that comprehensive education with whatever they major in, even if it's a science, they'll get the arts and humanities education. You know, so and the public university, they'll be the middle management functionaries in the society, lacking a comprehensive understanding of the culture that they are part of and international cultures. But the upper middle classes and upper class will have that. Exactly. Yeah. And white collar servitude, just because you're behind a desk with a computer and a tie, it's still servitude, right?
As you well know.
You're still a functionary, exactly, as I well know.
Right.
No, yeah,
We
you're
talk
just
about
you're
that.
cog in a wheel. You're
Yeah.
told what to do and you do it. You know.
Right?
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Good, but I'm wondering,
No, I'm good. No, we have some snacks.
thank you.
Definitely.
It's all great. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, indeed.
It's something I'll ask, but later in the conference, because I know you're super busy, or we want to try to extend our.
Now I'm really gonna have to fly.
Change our flight with it, because we'd like to see Jerusalem before. We don't want to come this far enough. Whether there's any hotels near the airport that you might recommend that we would move. So rather than drive, because it's like an hour from Villa Carmel to the airport. When we leave, stay at some hotel that are near the airport, and then we could probably figure it out.
Yeah, a little bit of a distance.
Yeah. And thanks for calling me at the crack of dawn this morning.
Couldn't believe it.
I apologize for calling you.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you so much. Because I saw they give us like an hour and 50. Right. So I think 19, like 2 minutes. Because otherwise I'll go back and trim my. Yeah. Right, and it might go, Right, to go, you don't want to do it, it's hard to listen. It's not so inconsiderate of your audience, but people want to ask normal mind. so much of what he's saying, and part of his point about you can't really generalize. The more you look into it, the less you can generalize, and it's true because there's so many parts of the BBC, and even in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you can look at Caribbean, parts of West Africa. A projected date when it's coming out, yeah? Another person looking for here, I hope you listen is Simon Parker.
I have to open a quiz now for my quiz. It's funny that you and Miriam are teaching it at the same time. With the last one, we did it like in succession. Like she did it the June and I did the August version. So there's like 22 of each section.
Never met him, so it'd be nice.
I've had about half of them.
But some interesting
So about 11 people. So, but it's not mandatory. So, yeah, and basically as a result of
Well,
like
as I mentioned when we met this morning, ended up in administration, and so it'll be a while before I can get back to it, but I've started doing some sort of following in the same after 15 years working with the Caribbean, BBC Caribbean Voices. He was seconded, as they call it, a lateral move to Ghana, and he set up a program quite similar to
there's 3 reported
but doing the same thing, and that helped not just Ghanaian.
Hi, everyone. Let's grab your seat for the next panel. Okay. Nia, you're okay with the... Okay. So I'll start by introducing our speakers. So welcome to the first regular panel, panel 1 on genre. And it is also the panel, so not only is on genre, but on artistic genre, right? So literature and art, and we'll see in a second. So we only have 2 speakers, as Raz Greenberg apologizes, but he couldn't make it today after all at the very last minute. So we will have 2 speakers. Our first speaker is my esteemed and beloved colleague and friend, Professor Daphna Erdinast-Vulcan from the English department at the University of Haifa. She's professor of English. She is the author of Graham Greene's Childless Fathers, Macmillan, 1988, Joseph Conrad and the Modern Temper, Oxford, 1991, The Strange Short Fiction of Joseph Conrad, Oxford, 1999, and between philosophy and literature, Bakhtin and the Question of the Subject, Stanford, 2013. She's also published numerous articles on the intersections of modernist literature, philosophy, and psychoanalytic thought. Today, she's going to talk to us about Human Voices, Penelope Fitzgerald at the BBC.
Thank you very much. First of all, an apology. The program looks absolutely fascinating, but I'm going abroad tomorrow early in the morning, and I'm really sorry that I'll have to miss it. I'm sure there's a lot to learn and think about in the papers, and hopefully I'll get to read some of them at some point. I'm going to talk about literature and about an author who is not well known outside of Britain, even in Britain, although she got the Booker Prize, she is not sufficiently well known, or I think, and I think people don't really do justice to her. So I'm going to try and correct some of this. The new title of the paper is "What Should the Voices Say?" What should the voices say? Penelope Fitzgerald at the BBC. Penelope Fitzgerald's Human Voices, written in 1980 when the author was 65, is a wartime novel set at Broadcasting House, the BBC's headquarters in Portland Square, London. Fitzgerald had worked at the BBC throughout the war from 1940 to 1945, and the novel portrays a gallery of variously eccentric characters, some probably modeled on real people, unfolding the stories of their lives and complex relationships at the time. In this paper, I would suggest that this misleadingly light novel carries a degree of gravitas which merits more serious consideration than it has hitherto received, and that much of its ethical ballast is premised on its intertextual relations with three canonical literary texts. The BBC is described at the outset as a cross between a civil service, a powerful moral force, and an amateur or theatrical company that wasn't too sure where next week's money was coming from. Broadcasting House resembles, quote, a huge liner headed on a fixed course south, with the best engineers in the world and a crew varying between the intensely respectable and the barely sane. It looked ready to scorn any disaster of less than Titanic scale. Since the outbreak of the war, the building has been lapped around by damn sandbags for protection, but once inside the bronze door, its interior suggests more strongly than ever a cruise on the Queen Mary. Depicted through the prolific use of nautical imagery, Broadcasting House is not unlike the island in Shakespeare's The Tempest, the first intertext on which we should focus. Far from a mere flight of fancy, this intertextual or intermedial relationship with Shakespeare's play is in fact historically grounded. The impressive front entrance of Broadcasting House is decorated with a grand marble relief commissioned by the BBC in 1929 from the artist Eric Gill and completed in 1933. Gill is a very, very controversial figure, and he's associated with two scandals which are not relevant to this paper, so I'll skip them for now. The figures carved on this relief are the characters of Shakespeare's play, The Tempest. Prospero, the magician king, standing 10 feet tall, holding Ariel, the spirit of the air, his servant and messenger. The choice of these figures by the BBC governors was probably based on an auditory echo, a pun on the resemblance of the name Ariel, the spirit of the air, and aerial, radio transmission, an oblique reference to the magic of broadcasting across the airwaves. The sculptor himself, we should note, was not impressed with this pun and regarded his work as a failure. I'm quoting from his autobiography, "The idea was grand, but I was incapable of carrying it out adequately. Prospero and Ariel, well, you think The Tempest and romance and Shakespeare and all that stuff, very clever of the BBC to hit on the idea. Ariel and Ariel, ha. Well, that's the artist, okay. And thus, when Jeff Haggard, the director of program planning known as PPD, leaves the building for the last time shortly before he's killed by a bomb, he looks up at the carving above the entrance where Prospero is shown preparing to launch his messenger onto the sound waves of the universe and recalls the artist at work. Fitzgerald makes sure that the auditory echo is not lost on the readers. A debate among the governors of the BBC relates to the parachute bombs falling on North London at the time, but the heated discussion at the meeting is concerned with whether they ought to be called aerial torpedoes on the 9 o'clock, as none of the newsreaders seem to be able to pronounce the word aerial. What is at issue then is the question of what should the voices say. That is the voices of the BBC. Human Voices, the title of the novel, is clearly related both to this question and to the last line of T.S. Eliot's poems, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, broadly considered one of the quintessential works of modernism, with its focus on alienation, isolation, and anxiety, and most importantly for us, the essential pettiness of human lives. It is, as most of you may remember, an odd love song, a dramatic monologue of a persona who portrays himself as an attendant lord rather than Hamlet, apprehensive, preoccupied by trivial social anxieties. Shall I part my hair behind? Who measures out his life with coffee spoons and does not dare disturb the universe. To recall just the first and last lines, let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. I grow old, I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. Shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare to eat a peach? I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I have heard the mermaids singing, each to each. I do not think that they will sing to me. We have lingered in the chambers of the sea by sea-girls wreathed with seaweed, red and brown, till human voices wake us and we drown. The Prufrock persona, Eliot seems to say, is the quintessential creature of the 20th century. There are neither epic nor tragic heroes in this day and age. Here too, Fitzgerald makes sure that the intertextual reference is not lost on her readers. When she introduces the real-time presence of the poet into an ostensibly casual conversation between Jeff Haggard and Mike, the American journalist, as they walk along the darkened streets at night, counting their steps to orient themselves in the London blackout. I knew a poet once, said Mac, coming to a halt. The remark had no connection with anything that went before. There are poets here too, Jeff pointed out. T.S. Eliot is here. You can see him going to Firewatch at his publisher's most nights. These are hard times for poets. Poetry has suffered its fate. Let's only hope that music doesn't follow it. To which Mac offers yet another apparently inconsequential response. Every man writes poetry once in his life. Did you know that? Eliot's poem, I suggest, serves as a thematic counterpoint to the novel. If the persona of Prufrock is the epitome of modernist depletion and disenchantment, Fitzgerald's novel offers a counter-vision, aiming at no less than a paradoxical re-enchantment of the world at its darkest hour, a recovery of the heroic in the most unlikely historical setting. Fundamentally different from the grand gestures of the epic or of Shakespearean tragedies, this revised version of the heroic is all we have, but it is just as inspiring. The narrative describes Broadcasting House as having its own personality and ethos. It is, quote, dedicated to the strangest project of the war or of any war, that is, telling the truth. Without prompting, the BBC had decided the truth was more important than consolation, and in the long run would be more effective. And yet there was no guarantee of this. Truth ensures trust, but not victory or even happiness. But the BBC had clung tenaciously to its first notion, droning quietly on at intervals from dawn to midnight, telling as far as possible exactly what happened. An idea so unfamiliar was bound to upset many of the other authorities, but they had got used to it little by little, and the listeners had always expected it. And thus, when Haggard reports on his meeting with the administration, he tells Brooks that the object of the meeting was to cut down the number of recordings in news transmissions in the interests of truth, as they said. The direct human voice must be used whenever we can manage it. There are to be no exceptions to the policy. The strokes of Big Ben, for a start, must always be relayed direct from Westminster, the real thing, never from disc. That's got to be firmly fixed in the listener's mind. Then, if Big Ben is silent, the public will know that the war has taken a distinctly unpleasant turn. The directive of authenticity or truth does not exclude even the stammer of the king, which must be relayed as it is. The recordings of His Majesty's speeches to the nation, where the stammer has been cleared away, should be reserved for a case of emergency only. This is the emergency in question, or as Haggard typically puts it, the distinctly unpleasant turn in the war is, of course, the probable scenario of a German invasion. Fitzgerald's insider description of life in Broadcasting House focuses on wartime constraints and urgencies. By the spring, I'm quoting, by the spring of 1940, there have been a number of castaways. During the early weeks of evacuation, variety, features, and drama had all been abandoned in distant parts of the country, while the majestic headquarters was left to utter wartime instructions, speeches, talk, and news. The corridors were full of talk producers without speakers, speakers without scripts, scripts which by a clerical error contained the wrong words or no words at all. The air seemed alive with urgency and worry. Recordings, above all, were apt to be mislaid. They looked alike, all 78s, aluminum discs coated on one side with acetate, whose pungent rankness was the true smell of the BBC's war. This apparent chaos is augmented by shortages and rationing, all part and parcel of wartime realities in Britain, within and without Broadcasting House. The queue at the canteen, where people have to use the one communal spoon tied to the cash register with a piece of string to stir their coffee. The careful and scrupulously fair division of 3 precious oranges, unobtainable in wartime Britain, obviously, among the 5 RP assistants. The damp sandbags which begin to rot, crumble, and sprout weeds with the onset of spring. And the makeshift dorms at the concert hall, which allow the work to go on while London is being bombarded nightly. Against the bleak context of wartime deprivation and anxieties, and later on during the nightly blitz, pulverizing London's houses into rubble and taking a heavy toll of death, the characters, some of whom are refugees from Europe, as you've heard in the talk before, all live with the near certitude of a German invasion, but immerse themselves in work, keeping all else at bay. Now, as autumn approached, with the exiles crowded awkwardly into their new sections, they were broadcasting in the strictest sense of the word, scattering human voices into the darkness of Europe in the certainty that more than half must be lost for the sake of the few that made their mark. And everyone who worked there, bitterly complaining about the short-sightedness of their colleagues, the vanity of the newsreaders, the remoteness of the controllers, and the restrictive nature of the canteen's 1 teaspoon, felt a certain pride which they had no way to express either then or since. Depicted without a hint of pathos in the novel, this is the heroism of endurance, self-sacrifice, and perseverance against all odds, but the characters themselves seem to be entirely unconscious of their own bravery. Vi and Lisa, both young assistants whose young men are fighting in France, get on with their work, desperately trying not to think of helpless waves of flesh against metal and salt water, or of the soundless fall of a telegram through the letterbox. And the European refugees enlisted by the BBC quietly work in the monitoring section, disguising their losses, transcribing page after page of Nazi broadcasts in a scholar's shorthand, listening to Beethoven's last quartets during their short breaks, and never raising their heads from their tasks, even during the air raids when they are instructed to go down to the basement. An imminent invasion is never far from the thoughts of those who carry the burden of responsibility, like Sam Brooks, the eccentric director of the Recorded Programs Department, RPD, who is passionately, unreasonably, and single-mindedly focused on the recording of sound and of the human voice. And Dr. Vogel, a German refugee, cruelly bent, deaf in one ear, but known to be the greatest expert in Europe on recorded atmosphere. Both these men are totally committed to an impossibly ambitious project launched after the Munich Agreement of 1938. The project, headed Lest We Forget Our Englishry, consists of recording the country's heritage, which means just about every single noise heard in England, and between their respective passions, there's not much hope of common sense prevailing. Dr. Vogel, a gentle, polite man, has been seen to take the arms of passers-by in his bony grip and beg to record their breathing, for he wished to record England's wheezing before the autumn fog begins. And Brooks produces recordings of more than 600 bands of creaking and squeaking, which he explains to the exasperated administrators of the BBC, are from the parish church of Hitherlickington, consisting of the hinges of the door and the door itself opening and shutting as the old women came in one by one with the stuff for the harvest festival. The passionate eccentricity of these characters takes on a much bleaker significance, however, when we realize that the goal of their project is to have copies of the recordings buried certain fathoms in the earth as a memorial for future generations. And their impossibly ambitious enterprise of recording all the noises and voices of England is clearly rooted in the near certainty of its imminent defeat and extinction. These, then, are the unsung heroes of the BBC. But heroism has more than one facet, and it is actually a female character, Nia Erlich, aged 18, newly arrived from Birmingham, recruited as junior recorded programs assistant, who offers the greatest counterweight to J. Alfred Prufrock. Asra, we are repeatedly told, is an unusual name, inevitably drawing speculation about its origin, of which Annie herself is apparently unaware. The rarity of the name is actually yet another authorial invitation to an intertextual reading. The Tribe of Asra features in a short poem by Heine under the same title. It is a poem about a slave who loves the Sultan's daughter, an impossible love at the outset, watching her by the fountain languishing silently growing paler and paler with each passing day. When the princess finally asks for his name, his homeland, and his nature, he replies, "I'm called Muhammad. I'm from Yemen, and my tribe, it is the Asra, who die when they love." Indeed, when Annie falls in love with Sam Brooks, her eccentric boss, who apparently doesn't really see her, and who she readily concedes is putting on weight and would probably not look like much in bed, her love is total and incurable, and just as it is hopeless. She falls in love with the RPD, absolutely, the narrative says, and hers must have been the last generation to fall in love without hope in such an unproductive way. After the war, the species no longer found it biologically useful, and indeed, it wasn't useful to Annie. She was in love, as she quite saw, with a middle-aged man who said the same thing to all the girls, who had been a prince for an evening which he'd most likely forgotten already, and who cared to the exclusion of all else for his work. An Asra by name and an Asra by nature, Annie's refusal of self-delusion is perfectly in keeping with the BBC motto about truth being better than consolation. Annie is described at the outset as unremarkable in any way, her most distinctive quality being her musicality, an absolute pitch which actually complicates her life. Being the daughter of a piano tuner, she is a listener who can detect the slightest tonal distortion, and her uncompromising truthfulness triggers the initial conflict with the man with whom she'd fall in love, when he demands that she should sit down and listen with him. Sorry, is it me doing that? I guess so. No? It's fun? Okay. Okay. So she falls in love with him, and they have this initial conflict when he demands that she should sit down and listen with him to a piece of recorded music. He speaks of the near perfection, the quality, the balance of the piece, but Annie quietly responds that the singer was flat. This sets the tone for their entire relationship. Sam is initially furious at her refusal to adapt to his neediness and confides in Dr. Fogel about this bewildering girl who chose to set up her sense of hearing against his. After all, he says, perfect pitch is something you're born with, like a sense of humor. To which Dr. Fogel replies, certainly, Sam, you yourself were born with neither, but you are a good man, a fine man. This, the omniscient narrator tells us, was the first time in his life that Sam Brooks had ever been obliged to change his opinion of himself. As he grows more self-conscious and aware of other people, the persona of the bare-turned prince who could only be led by a maiden or a child disappears, and he becomes more vulnerable and more human in the eyes of his disciples. He becomes, in other words, a better listener. Jeff Haggard, director of the program planning, or PPD, is another unsung hero of the BBC war. He is the reticent, seemingly detached figure who faces the world with an imperturbable surface, truthful and dry, and is constantly aware of the possibility of a German invasion. This awareness comes to the surface when he pulls the plug on General Pinard, a French war veteran, a hero, who urges the listeners to be realistic and surrender to the Germans. He tells them, you have no chance. Haggard's fast response shuts off the general's potentially catastrophic and demoralizing speech, but also results in 10 minutes of utter silence on the home network. When asked to account for it later, he explains in his characteristically understated manner that he had interfered with the broadcast because he, quote, felt that what the general was going to say wouldn't, on the whole, be helpful to the nation at this particular junction. He knows that in the face of an imminent enemy takeover, or as he typically puts it, being within measurable distance of invasion, there are voices to which the people should not listen, that it is sometimes better not to be realistic. Significantly, the breakup of the broadcast and apparent failure on the part of the BBC to speak to its listeners only generates greater public confidence in the utter truthfulness of the institution. This, it seems, is analogous to the authenticity of His Highness stammering when he speaks to the nation, or to the imperfect live strokes of Big Ben. The very imperfection of the sound is the guarantee of its authenticity and truthfulness. A powerless Prospero, Haggard makes his exit when he realizes that his work is done, and is shortly afterwards killed by the bomb. But this enigmatic character, whose second wife had left him because she could never get him to raise his voice, and who is more of a listener than a speaker, has fully earned his obituary, which says that his voice in particular will be much missed. There's much more to be said about voices, voicing, and listening in this novel. But as our revels now are ended, to quote Prospero, let me conclude very briefly with a thought about reenchantment. Unlike the disembodied official voice of authority, the human voices in the title refer both to the endless diversity of recorded voices and noises broadcast by the BBC, and to the individual, concrete, and highly eccentric voices of the heroic characters. But the novel is also primarily, I think, about the capacity for listening to human voices and to human silences, a capacity which may ultimately help us create, even in the bleakest of times, a re-enchanted world for ourselves. Perhaps, after all, there's no necessary contradiction between truth and consolation. Thank you.
Thank you, Daphna. Our next speaker is Nia Erlich, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Arts at Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in Israel. She completed her PhD in the Department of Art History at the University of Edinburgh and was a Polonsky postdoctoral fellow at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. She's the author of articles on realism, serious games, animation, and documentary. Her book, Animating Truth, on animated documentary and the virtualization of culture in the 21st century, was published in 2021 by Edinburgh University Press. And she is currently working on a project on art and robotics, focusing on AI and machine vision. Thank you, Nia. Oh, and her title today is called Animating the News.
This one? So just forward and back. And how do I start the, no, the clips? That one? That one as well. Okay. Okay, thank you. Okay. Hi there. We had a slight technical glitch, so I want you to imagine how everything is perfectly timed, okay, even though it might not be. But because I have a few more minutes, I might show you slightly longer clips, so it actually works well. Okay, so hi everyone. It's really good to be here. My name is Nia Erlich, and I'm an art historian whose research focuses on animation and experimental documentaries, or more generally, emerging nonfiction aesthetics. Now, David Hendy mentioned historians leaning towards more highbrow culture like documentaries, whereas media researchers take seriously entertainment. I'll be combining the two today. I'll be discussing animation used in BBC News segments and what epistemological and ethical ramifications this may have. My main claim is that animation may have seemed experimental, whereas now it's become mainstream, and it changes its epistemological value and raises many questions. No, I didn't do that. My title, Animated, is actually about animated imagery, but also I want to focus for a minute about the definition of animation as something with a dynamic nature. And that actually symbolizes the changing nature of what journalism is today, nonfiction is today, and sadly also what we think of truth today. So just to clarify, there are endless techniques and styles of animation, not to mention definitions, which I can't get into. I'm specifically interested in animated images that don't look photorealistic, so they don't attempt to look real. And that juxtaposition between artificial imagery, so-called, and factual content is something that I'm most interested in. And of course, that idea of artificiality and truth are central issues foregrounded in animated nonfiction. I'm going to show you 3 examples of the way that animation is being used at the BBC, ranging from the late 1970s until now. Whereas in the earlier examples, it was used to reflect upon the content and its representation, now it's being used in a less critical manner. So let's begin. When I came across the call for paper for this conference, I was immediately drawn to the BBC's mission statement, which is to inform, educate, and entertain. And although this may relate to the wide span of BBC productions, I was interested in how these 3 goals come across within the nonfiction and news segments. Now, informing and educating obviously are relevant to the news and nonfiction. And in fact, if I borrow from Philip Rosen in documentary studies, the whole concept of to document actually has 2 meanings, which is 1, to indicate or teach, and 2, evidence and proof. So it fits in beautifully. And this is a disclaimer where I sin and I actually relate to documentary and journalism as overlapping disciplines at times, whereas more purist views may disagree with me, so I apologize in advance. Now, the problem today is that documents, evidence, and what provides a sense of truth and believability are, unfortunately, a tricky topic in today's so-called post-truth world, which is why I'm so interested in new ways to present nonfiction and what implications these new forms of representation may have. And this brings me to the issue of entertainment in the BBC's mission. When I started delving deeper into the BBC's mission statement, I came across the next very interesting and related public purpose. To show the most creative, highest quality and distinctive output and services, the BBC should provide high-quality output in many different genres and across a range of services and platforms, which sets the standard in the United Kingdom and internationally. Its services should be distinctive from those provided elsewhere and should take creative risks, even if not all succeed, in order to develop fresh approaches and innovative content. How does this emphasis on creativity and entertainment coincide with informing and educating? Well, I think this is part of a larger cultural shift in regard to the way that factual content is engaged with these days. And I'll briefly point to, the documentary turn in visual culture, which means that for several decades now, there's been a growing interest and tendency within documentary studies for more experimental and artistic documentaries, forms, and reportage. And some of you may be familiar with forensic architecture, which is a huge example of the way that they use new media, 3D animation, different simulations to engage with truth and actually create idea of evidence. So this idea that how do you produce truth, how do you explore what truth is now becoming wider and wider and therefore brings in different fields. The second reason that I think these changes are part of a larger media tendency are documentary hybrids that we have everywhere. We've got docudrama, which is about real events as dramatic occurrences. We've got mockumentary, which is exactly the opposite, right? Artificial events, but using documentary conventions and journalism conventions. We've got reality TV, we've got edutainment, which is the combination of education and entertainment, or infotainment, information and entertainment. And if I use a local example, and because the elections are coming up, Channel 2 News will often correspond with which is a satirical show. And the fact that they bring the two together, what does that say about our time is that the overload of information, that means that trying to grab people's attention, we're trying to create something more entertaining. And what does that mean about the representational choices that now exist within nonfiction? I'll also mention changes in journalism with the politicization of the news, declining circulation of traditional media alongside the competition with social media data sources. Journalism is often characterized by a rush to publish and attention-seeking sensationalism, which can easily create a decline in trust. And that leads to truthiness in the sense of post-truth, where objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. And this requires new forms of representation, drawing people in. And I'll give you an example of how animation deals precisely with that sense of something more personal, something that creates more empathy, more emotion. These changes in representation actually focus on what do audiences tend to believe and why, and how can criticality be promoted. So this brings me to animation as a creative form of representation that can evoke and encourage the most critical of viewing, or alternatively, it can act as misinformation and disinformation at its best. Now, just to clarify, even though animation has a very long and complex history, Disney's pivotal role in creating animated content meant that it was culturally understood as removed from the real. It was frequently associated with childhood entertainment, with fantastical content, or simplified or safeguarded educational matter like sexual education. But animation, when used in nonfiction, as an informative representational aesthetic, can easily be discussed as oxymoronic or distinctive, definitely a creative risk that coincides with the purpose of the BBC. But the use of animation in nonfiction also raises new questions about the approaches to the content at hand. Now, BBC has a very long history of using animation in nonfiction to inform, educate, and entertain. The first two BBC examples were released in 1977 and 1978 as the BBC's Animated Conversations. It was a collaboration of documentary filmmaking with Aardman Animation Studios. And the idea was that they got really excited about using found audio footage with this clearly constructed animated visuals. These later expanded to 5 more films using audio recordings for the BBC, Channel 4, and in 1983, they made conversation pieces, which I'm going to show you now. And it doesn't work. This is what I was saying, be patient with me. Everything worked beautifully on Google Slides. I need help. I need technical help, please. Clip him over them. Hi there. Yeah, it's a mouse. No, it's a mouse. Yeah, here, here. Yeah. There we go. Yeah, I know, but it disappears. There. Okay, good. Thank you. Focus back. Conversation pieces, 1983, BBC.
Broadcasting 19 hours a day on 238 and 96.3 FM in stereo. Time for the latest news. Here's David Garmston.
The Coal Board says it's going ahead with the closure of 2 pits in Scotland and South Wales, despite appeals by miners and the threat of a major confrontation by NUM leader Arthur Scargill.
9 minutes past the hour, 6 o'clock on Radio West. Welcome along. It's the Radio West Breakfast Show with Roger Day sitting in for John Hayes, who's on holiday for another week and a half. think I'll manage to make it there.
Roger Day, on the radio web.
6, 6 minutes past 12. Hang on, 12 minutes past 6. 6:12. It's early. Not a bad morning out there. Mind you, you can hardly see it at the moment. I'll let you know what it's like when the sun comes up, if it...
Okay, sorry to do that so bluntly, but the mouse doesn't work, basically. Okay, so as you'll see, this film that I showed you now, it's all about reporting, but everything about this film highlights the gap between what is seen and what is heard. What is heard is the evidentiary status of these found footage or interviews, and what we see is this constructed artificial material that doesn't hide its constructed nature. So what this does is it indirectly destabilizes viewer assumptions. It makes viewers question the relationship between using audio recordings or the sense of what is it that makes me believe the content versus something that is so clearly artificial. So why use animation in the news and in nonfiction settings? And there are quite a few reasons. Let me walk you through this. First of all, visual reenactment. What do we do when there is no photographic footage, right? Especially in this day and age when we've become so accustomed to everyone having their iPhone in their back footage or surveillance cameras, we've become accustomed to having visual footage of everything. Animation allows us to fill those gaps. Representing subjective perspectives. What if it's something about a personal story that you want to get across? Animation really allows you to get into the head of someone else. Representing the unphotographable, and this can be endless things. This can be outer space, this can be science, but it really gives you that visual opportunity to engage with never-ending content. Censorship. What do you do when you don't have access? Censorship allows you to provide visibility even when things are invisible. Maintaining anonymity, once again, that has to do with that invisibility. You can protect the identity of your protagonists. Emphasizing the gap between content and representation. I've seen wonderful animated journalism and documentaries where the style is almost Disney-esque, very cute, very childhood-oriented. The content is horrific. That gap makes you pay attention. Memorable imagery. Think of Persepolis, think of Waltz with Bashir, for example. And journalistic games in VR, this is what my book is about. It's about the use of animation in these contents in evolving media. So I hope I've shown you that there are many reasons to use animation in nonfiction. The juxtaposition between the audio and the visual that we just saw raises many questions about the use of animation in nonfiction, if it is believable and a worthy aesthetic to use in nonfiction, and if so, why? And this is even more relevant today when animation has become really omnipresent in varied media. Just think of using your GPS. You're actually watching an animated map, an animated translation of yourself on screen as you go through the physical world. So we're becoming more and more used to getting information through animation. But as I'll demonstrate, less and less emphasis is put on the critical viewing mode for viewers. A good case study to begin examining the use of animation in the news, and this isn't BBC to start from, is Tomo News by Next Media Animation, which is a Taiwan-based broadcasting channel launched in 2009. Most of the videos there incorporate animation, giving Tomo News a visual edge. The use of animation enables the visual inclusion of what is not photographed, and it plays an important marketing role in the website that claims, and I quote, "Never watch boring news again." Once again, think of the attention-grabbing and entertainment value that animation can provide. Now, Tomo News initially targeted the Hong Kong and Taiwanese markets, and it was a great success. Now it has expanded to English-speaking world markets. And despite their evident local success, Tomo News has been frequently criticized. So for example, in 2010, Howard Kurtz from the Washington Post media critic and the host of CNN's Reliable Sources remarked, "Let's not confuse a bunch of cartoons with what people in the news business do." However, Next Media explained that the images in many of their videos were based on other media reports and thus maintained, and I quote, the integrity of the news. Do with that what you will. In fact, what I found interesting when I was researching this is that comments on the CNN reportage about Next Media reflected unfavorably about sensationalism of many other non-animated news channels, claiming that news is a joke, journalism is dead anyway, facts are a thing of the past. And it's hardly surprising then that if this is the context towards regular news, if you will, that animated news has emerged out of such widespread allegations against the regular channels. And this overall changes what we think of as believable representation. Now, the way in which animation is used and received depends on changing cultural conventions. That's all there is. Next Media officials predicted that by 2012, their clips would not only be known abroad, and they won't be known as amusing novelty, but would actually become the norm for TV news. And such predictions have actually come true. The use of animation in factual reporting is increasingly a journalistic norm, not a marketing scam or a quirky choice. In 2012, a study about effects of animation in news reports found that animated formats neither enhance nor dampen the credibility of the news. So what can animation in news reportage do? For example, Next Media has actually worked with BBC and Reuters on joint animation projects, mostly on the topic of refugees, in order to maintain anonymity and provide a strong sense of visual metaphor about the experiences they've had but can't film. I'll try to show you another clip now. This is Rachel's story. It's from a series called Seeking Refuge, about young people who have sought asylum in the UK as told by the children themselves. Let's see if the mouse works. There we go.
Life in my country was quite distressing. I didn't attend school because my mother was of a particular religion that my country doesn't favor. I could see other children around me experiencing a normal childhood, going to school, playing outside with their friends. I just felt very different. Because in the UK, being a Christian isn't a problem, but in my country, which is a predominantly Muslim country, it wasn't a favored religion or tradition. But my mum kept on going secretly to church on Sundays, and when the police invaded the secret services that they were having, the whole atmosphere was full of kind of flames. Felt like everything was going to burst out. And my mum was treated very bad from the local citizens, and she felt like she wanted to escape somewhere. We secretly decided to leave. We didn't let anyone know. I think my father found someone to take us at the back of a lorry, I think it was. We were clutched together. We slept and slept and slept, and it was very dark, so we couldn't really see whether daylight had come. We lost track of time. It was a kind of journey that we didn't know where it would lead to. We got to the UK. I had begun to experience the childhood that I'd been dreaming about. I had friends, I played outside very comfortably and safe. I had a kind of normal family life. But then the decision letter came that we had been rejected leave to remain in this country. It was the letter that changed everything. This one piece of paper just changed my whole life once again. At 6 o'clock in the morning, these huge men, like huge monsters, they came to our house and they put us in a van, and they took us to a detention center. So there's a lot of closed doors, banging all the time, huge walls that you can't see from. I always used to look up on the wall and think, I wish I could fly and just escape. I can remember once I held the bars in my hands, and
I'm going to stop this.
I couldn't believe that I was just stuck in a prison.
Okay. I want you to consider the differences between the examples I showed you. Whereas the first example, conversation pieces, really emphasizes that gap between what we could consider documents or evidence, which is the audio recording, and the visual. Here, the use of animation does something completely different. And if I follow Annabelle Honus-Rowe, she discusses animation's interpretive function, where animation doesn't have to look realistic, but it definitely adds expressive layers of meaning. So as we see here, the aesthetic choices like the huge shadowed hands that grab Rachel and her family, they remove her from home, obviously emphasize a sense of vulnerability, nightmarish events, and even the larger invisible forces at work, be they political, racist, and so on. And I want to pause here for just a moment and consider the potential ethical ramifications of animated depictions such as these. I want to discuss animation as providing visibility versus obliteration, and animation's ability to create desensitization versus resensitization. Now, what do I mean? Whereas using animation promises anonymity, and as such it's often used to depict people on the margins of society who need that anonymity in order to tell their stories, this means that animation can provide visibility. However, animated styles vary greatly. I've seen children and asylum seekers depicted in varied styles, from hand-knitted birds to realistic animation to white dots and black stick figures. And these protagonists tend to be shown as cartoonish, generic humans. And this may evoke empathy because anyone and everyone can be represented in this way, which challenges the basic idea of marginality through representation. Images like these are different from photorealistic imagery. They can embody interpretation and symbolism, which can create resensitization in an apathetic viewing culture that is sadly quite accustomed to the pornography of horror. However, since people depicted or seen as white dots or animated characters, it can also be argued that they're actually obliterated by not seeming real enough, which weakens any ethical response or urgency, turning real people into mere icons or cartoons. And this representation can therefore create dangerous and desensitized viewing. Now, whereas novel aesthetics may be seen as defamiliarizing and therefore as jolting, the opposite can be argued. The idea is that as we become more and more accustomed to this kind of imagery, giving us factual content, how does that affect us as viewers? It means that we no longer think about the representational choices involved. Okay? Sorry, I gave myself more time because of... Okay. And here I want to give you the last example. This was shown on the BBC. It's the reenactment of the fatal crash of Malaysia Airlines in 2014. I don't know what is happening here. Okay, there we go. There we go.
The reconstruction demonstrates the effects of the impact and shows the marks where the cockpit was torn from the rest of the fuselage. The high-energy objects that perforated the aeroplane were all fragments and traces of paint point to a missile carrying a specific type of warhead and launched by a Buck surface-to-air missile system. During the investigation, a number of computer simulations were conducted. These support the surface-to-air missile scenario. The detonation of a 9N314M model warhead was simulated to calculate a point of detonation as well as the damage that could be expected. The warhead exploded on a location in space less than 1 cubic meter to the left of and above the cockpit.
Okay, thank you. I think you'll see for yourself that that last example is anything but expressive, anything but imaginative. The whole point of it is to not make you ask questions. You're given the dry facts in this godlike voiceover, right? Don't question us. These are the facts. And just think of that, because visually, it looks constructed. It doesn't look real. But as we get accustomed to these representations, we just accept it as true. Now, Bruno Latour suggested that the relation between representation, reality, and the truth claims that are capable of being obtained lead to unrealistic expectations. And I quote, "We're asking from representation something it cannot possibly give, namely representation without any representation." And he explains that people have been sold the idea of transparent representation and have come to believe that if only there was no mediation, the better our grasp of truth would be. But the problem is, of course, that we have no access to reality other than through representation, which isn't reality itself, but stands for reality as exactly that, representation. And as philosopher Nelson Goodman says, it's vital to remember that what viewers recognize as realistic and believable is only based on familiarity and conventions. It's all about how easy it is to read. So once the aesthetics of representation are no longer perceived as aesthetics because we've become so numbed to the use of animation in nonfiction, these aesthetics become transparent because the representation is read as if it were reality itself. And this has huge important political implications. Since once representation is no longer seen as such, what is represented can be viewed as natural, making it seem real rather than cultural and constructed. And what I was most interested in, what I tried to show you here through these three examples, is how the BBC is an excellent example of how the use of animation is changing within our nonfiction media environments over the last couple of decades. And I just want to end by saying that as the BBC poses a mission to inform, educate, and entertain in an era of fake news, it's become crucial for the 21st century world politics to address these issues, since creative representations can have very different outcomes, and only by contemplating them seriously can their implications be further understood. So thank you very much.
You're talking about kind of learning, Daphne, you're talking about the many different intertexts, and you know, if you don't know the Tempest, then you won't get that. So we need to be educated in a way in order to gain a whole other layer of meaning. And Nia, something similar is going on with the kind of education that viewers gain when we watch more and more animation. We're becoming literate. And yet, in your talk, you're saying that literacy kind of numbs us. And so the question, I suppose, is how much light and how much darkness is emerging from this literacy? So, you know, on one hand, we want to be aware and conscious of the tools of representation. But on the other hand, the more that we become aware of them, the less we take note of them, I think seems to be your point. And with Daphne, it seems as though if we need the footnotes to actually gain the meaning. So I don't know if that turned into a question in the end or not, but thank you for your talks.
Most people would be familiar with, most readers would be familiar with. And then as I read on, I discovered that there were other texts too. And that, you know, this whole thing about the Tempest and Eric Gill and everything, it was actually there. It's history. It's not, you know, it's not something that she's invented. And Asra also, the Heine poem, she's, at some point in her letters, Penelope Fitzgerald, I think it was a letter, she complained about the reviewer who missed the Asra connection. So it's all very, very conscious. She's a very conscious and very literate writer herself. And this, I think, clashes with the very light-handed character of the novel. The novel is funny, readable. People think that she's writing comedies of manners, and I think that's doing her serious injustice. And I think what she does is she uses these literary texts as a kind of deep structure, and that's the beauty of what she does. Like she has this novel on that takes place in Russia in 1913, just before the revolution, and it's amazingly authentic. And people reading this are saying, "How does she do it? How does she do it?" But actually, there's a very interesting kind of relationship with Tolstoy there. And she calls it The Beginning of Spring. Obviously, goes back to his last novel. So it's amazing to me. But this kind of scaffolding of literacy that I think you're referring to is not absolutely necessary for enjoyment, but I think it is absolutely necessary for understanding. And she has the big statement that she makes is that culture can re-enchant the world. That we live in a disenchanted world, and culture can re-enchant
it. I think that what you were thinking of as literacy, I think of as awareness of conventions. And since my work tends to be more in the sense of politically which messages can be presented in which ways, you have to be very aware of the conventions in order to try to break them, right? And I was thinking, I think it was Boris Groys who he talks about, he tries to define what the contemporary is, and he says that the contemporary is that moment of breaking, of you notice the new uses, unusual uses of something that you're used to using differently. And that break is just before it becomes commonplace. And that's something that I was really interested in. So also as a definition of the times conventions, but also as a strategy to kind of gain attention and evoke change in that sense.
Thank you very much for two fascinating presentations. As a national broadcaster, it's always thinking in terms of supply and demand. And David mentioned Beeb as still is. Very much white middle class. And your two presentations talk about things which, to a certain extent, are supplying things which are not mainstream, run-of-the-mill. They are, as you said, Penelope is, despite the book, is not that well known, and animation is definitely not the Beeb's normal style. So my question is, looking at the demand side, to what extent has the Beeb maybe provided this as an experiment, or a presenter has, or an editor, or an author? To what extent have they evaluated the demand side and tried to capitalize and give more of this? And also looking maybe at the time slots, maybe looking at the population changes, the demographic changes, the literacy changes. Has Beeb actually evaluated the demand? Have they done surveys to ascertain this? Or has this been more of this supply driven by individuals?
I don't have statistics about the BBC, but I do have statistics about animated documentaries. So when I started my research, which was about 15 years ago, there were numerous examples, but if you Google animated documentary today, I think last time I checked it was 29 million. So statistically, there are more people making animation because technologically it's easier to create these days, but there's also more demand, definitely. Now in the BBC, I can say that the earliest example that I said was the conversation pieces has now created, I don't remember the name, but it's the Listening Project, I think. So now there are more and more interviews, okay, that are being animated in order to give this kind of widespread, kind of very wide-ranging insight to different people's experiences. So in that sense, I definitely do think that the BBC has capitalized on this growing interest in animation. As an animation scholar, I can say that it's definitely not on the sides of anything anymore, but it's rather kind of connected to everything these days. If it's user interfaces or special effects, digital imagery. So even that makes it harder to define, because even if it looks real, it could be animation. So maybe you think you're watching something photographic on the BBC, but you're not. So I think, yeah, it's difficult to define these days.
Yes,
you can have me.
Fascinating talks, both of you. This question is for Nia, because I'm thinking about media, and I'm thinking in particular about the medium of animation. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about animation in particular, because I was very struck by that animation of the refugee story, in particular because I saw a live installation at a theater last year in Washington that was based on refugee stories, where a group, they're called Vox Modus from Scotland, animated a novel by putting little dioramas that you then viewed. So it was like very old-fashioned live installation. The room revolved and you looked at different dioramas, almost exactly like that animation. So it was super striking, but the attempt to make a live action experience, immersive experience, as opposed to an animation. So I wonder if you could just speak to why animation in particular has these truth effects that you're representing, or whether it's different from the kind of experience that you might describe, you know, if you saw either an in-person play, you read a novel, or you watched this kind of immersive experience.
I could talk about this for hours, so I won't. This is where I wish Raz Greenberg, who was supposed to be on the panel, was here, because his research is actually about the definition of animation, so he would definitely take this question. But I think what's so interesting about the example that you raised, there's a material aspect that you're describing. So by bringing the viewer into the animated experience, like you had, I would say that makes it more real in a sense. Now, this has a lot to do with VR and the way that animation is used in the metaverse, which again, I can talk a lot about. But it's this idea of once you get used to seeing everything in animated form, it doesn't matter anymore. So bringing you into the experience is, I call this the documentary experience. It's not documentary viewing anymore, okay? As long as they can pull you in, and it doesn't matter what medium or technology they're using, that kind of makes the animated, non-realistic visuals less important. So I'd say that was it.
One of the things that struck me as a kind of intersection between the two presentations is what I think of as the literary or literariness on the one hand and visuality on the other, and a kind of intersection between the aesthetic and the political, in this sense that Daphne, the presentation on drawing on Fitzgerald's drawing on the Tempest, and the kind of almost farcical recording and memorialization of noises. And yet, as Derek Walcott and others have said, in The Tempest, the most pathetic figure, Caliban, is given some of the most beautiful lines. Be not afeard, the isle is full of noises. So the politics of a Caliban and a Prospero. And Nia, in terms of the visuality of animation, it sort of struck me as the kind of distance between the simile and the metaphor, where this thing is like this thing, and then when you go to the next step, the metaphor, this thing is this thing. There are ways in which you might, the political piece, there are ways in which you might treat this thing differently than this other thing. And so if you say this thing, so you treat B in a particular way that you wouldn't treat A. And if you say A is like B, there is still a space to avoid a certain kind of politics at the level of the simile. If you move to metaphor, A is B. Now A can be treated like B. It isn't a properly formulated question, but your thoughts?
Actually, when Haggard leaves Broadcasting House for the last time, looks up at the relief above the entrance, he does think about Caliban, and he does think about, he tells himself, well, Ariel was a liar, actually. It was Caliban who always told the truth because he didn't know how to lie. And he curses Prospero for teaching him language, because this language is what enables you to lie. And he leaves Broadcasting House with this thought that it's okay that Caliban remains on the island. It's now completely his, now that Prospero has left. And he too is a kind of Prospero. He's powerless. He cannot perform any magic. He does his best, and he's a deeply decent human being. But the thought is there. But Fitzgerald doesn't take it any further than this. This is as far as it goes. It's not in the text. I mean, there's no, you don't find the kind of political awareness that you're talking about, except for that thought which I excised from the paper because of constraints of time.
I just want to say that I love this idea of the simile and the metaphor, and I was thinking of Leonard Cohen and the cracks. That's where the light comes in, right? And like when there is that space, that's what makes you think. That's what makes you notice. And I'm afraid of precisely that moment, right, when A becomes B, in that example of the airlines, where you stop questioning, right, and everything is sealed off. So, thank you for that.
Does that work? Hey, thank you. These were very enjoyable papers and thought-provoking. I have a question to Nia. It actually taps into your comment really nicely. So you point to this loss of awareness that when we watch animation, that we are watching a representation, right? And so I wonder what distinguishes animated representation from other forms of news, because at the end of the day, we watch news which had been curated for us. The text had been written, the events of the day had been chosen, structured in particular order of grave to mildly entertaining. And I think there is really very little, if at all, general awareness that news content is man-made, structured, representative, and carefully curated as a representation of what happened today. Same for doco, right? So these are, narratives and stuff. So I wonder in what way animated representations that you're thinking about are distinct from the news more broadly.
Well, I think that's why I mentioned the whole idea of the documentary hybrids, in the sense that I think viewers are becoming more aware of the edited versions and the manipulation, and everything is curated, of course, because as you say, everything is some form of representation. I think why I decided to focus specifically on animation in this sense was because its artificial nature was so foregrounded because of it. Well, I specifically focus on non-photorealistic animation, as I said, animation that does not attempt to look real. And that was mind-boggling to me, that sense that even though it doesn't look real, it almost becomes invisible as representation, and just almost how frighteningly easy, even if it takes several decades or several years, okay, to kind of change that convention. And what does that mean about the kind of information that we're consuming? I think that's the main difference for me.
Hello. So first of all, thank you both for wonderful talks. I think this question is relevant to you both in a way. So when you were both talking about dealing with history and representing history and presenting the events real, I couldn't help but rethink or think back about the classic BBC sitcom Blackadder, especially the fourth series, Blackadder Goes Forth, which is set in World War I. Now, when it aired in the late 80s, there were still many World War veterans alive, and there was controversy whether this representation was acceptable or not. There were some people who said, this is exactly what we were feeling back in the day, because it captured the ridiculousness of the war in a way, but there were some that said, World War I was such a dark period in our history, and it should not be presented lightly. Now, considering what you both said, do you think that presenting history or parodying history or satirizing dark events in history is a step in accepting the horrors and dealing with dark events in history, or is it just a way to present it lightly and to keep people away from dealing with it critically?
It's a difficult question, actually. I don't think